Worries over the vulnerability of our technology and computer networks dominated the day for travelers and for Wall Street. Even before what turned into a series of cascading computer failures, hacking, intelligence, and national security were already the focus of a day of hearings on Capitol Hill.
The nation's biggest airline, biggest stock exchange, and most prominent business newspaper suffered long service interruptions. First, an internet router issue at United Airlines suspended all its flights for nearly 2 hours. The problem led to 800 flight delays and 60 cancellations. Then, shortly before noon, what was labeled a technical problem halted trading at the New York Stock Exchange. It lasted almost 4 hours, the longest suspension of trading on that exchange in several years. Finally, the website of the Wall Street Journal suffered technical difficulties that sent readers to a temporary site. Well, we explore disruptions and vulnerabilities now with Michael Regan of Bloomberg News and Kevin Mandia, who is the president of FireEye. That's a company that specializes in dealing with cybersecurity and network protection. And we welcome you both to the program. Michael Regan, to you first. Let's start with the New York Stock Exchange, closed down for over 3 hours. How big a disruption was this, and what's known about what caused it?
Well, the problems at the New York Stock Exchange actually started even before the market opened, when traders send pre-market orders to the exchange. And it was clear that the communication between brokerages and the exchange was not working properly. A lot of customers were not getting the confirmations that their orders had been received. So that obviously can cause a lot of problems. It could possibly cause traders to resend orders and have duplicate orders in the system. And at first, it looked like it was just a routine glitch that exchanges deal with all the time. However, by about 11:30, as you said, the exchange made the decision to shut down trading on that exchange. Now, it's important to point out that there are 11 official stock exchanges in the U.S. right now, and in the neighborhood of 50 alternative venues where trades can be matched. So the market was able to function pretty much as normal. They simply routed orders away from the New York Stock Exchange to the other exchanges out there. That said, it certainly is the type of thing that can affect investor confidence, especially after a long series of glitches on electronic exchanges that we've seen over the last 5 years or so.
And what about the two other institutions we mentioned? Of course, United Airlines, where flights were delayed, were canceled, and the Wall Street Journal.
So United had an issue with the computer router, which is the device that connects various networks, and it caused them not to be able to issue tickets to passengers and not be able to dispatch staff properly. So it shut down flights for about 2 hours. At the same time, about 20 minutes or so after the New York Stock Exchange went down, the Wall Street Journal homepage, as you said, started having issues and was unavailable. So there was a lot of sort of speculation flowing through the markets that all three incidents were related and that there was some sort of, targeted attack on the U.S. Those concerns were dismissed pretty quickly. The officials from the companies said that they were not related. Homeland Security said it did not appear like cyber attacks were the issue. So at the moment, it looks like it was just 3 separate computer issues at 3 separate companies. It is possible the Wall Street Journal got a lot of heavy traffic after the New York Stock Exchange shut down when people went to look up the news about what was going on. So although they haven't said that, that certainly sounds like a plausible explanation.
Kevin Mandia, what would you add to that in terms of what's known about the cause and whether there was the possibility of some cyber attack?
Well, anytime you have, your network goes dark, you have a hardware software problem or a security problem. So it's one of the 3 or a combination of them. But right now, everything I'm hearing, it's a software glitch or a hardware problem. And no one's talking about a security issue here. What we can take from this, though, is the day there are attacks and there are security issues, it is always good to have a second way to do business. Go back to the old-fashioned way of doing things, whether it is a hardware, software, or security issue. So we probably got a good drill today.
Well, Kevin Mandia, staying with you, what does this tell us, if anything, about the vulnerability of these big systems? And I realize they're all very different operations, because we know the technology is getting bigger, it's getting more complex. What does it say about their ability to handle that?
Well, we rely on these things, but I think we're doing pretty good. It's hard to be in airlines and go dark and have nobody notice, or to be a news outlet like the Wall Street Journal and go dark and have nobody notice, or be a stock exchange and not have availability and nobody notice. So you're talking three of the most prominent businesses or industries you can be in. There's nowhere to hide when you have an issue like this, but these issues don't come up every day, and I anticipate we'll probably go multiple years before we see something like this happen again.
Michael Regan, as somebody who has covered the exchanges and covers Wall Street, how vulnerable do these institutions think they are to this sort of thing? Do they feel they're prepared for what may come?
Well, you know, the U.S. stock market has become this massive, complex computer system spread out over, like I said, so many different exchanges. These type of glitches do happen from time to time. This was, you know, this one made headlines because it's the New York Stock Exchange. It's an icon. But again, what happens today sort of, you know, shows how it's good that the system is spread out over this many exchanges, that when one goes down, the others are able to take up the slack and take over the business for them temporarily. And, you know, in that respect, it was a success today that the system operated that way. That said, there are a lot of people that believe, a lot of critics of the industry that believe it has gotten way too complex, that we don't need 11 stock exchanges and 50 other venues, that, you know, maybe 4 or 5 would be enough. And this is certainly going to reignite the debate about whether or not the market has become too complex.
Well, pick that up, Kevin Mandia, whether it's a stock exchange or the airlines or another big institution, how prepared are they for the kind of incredibly more complicated technological world that we know we're heading into?
Well, everybody's trying to get more prepared. That's what we're all doing. So if you look over the last 15 years in cybersecurity, there's been more and more attacks. The watermark of security is going up in our nation because everybody's more aware with all the headlines that you read almost on a daily basis about another attack or another threat. We don't have good rules in cyberspace right now. We have countries hacking other countries. We have criminals trying to hack on a daily basis. So everybody's getting more prepared for that, because right now if you're hacked, whether you're hacked by a 15-year-old kid or hacked by a military garnering intelligence from your organization, the liabilities are the same. So everybody's really raising their awareness.
Kevin Mandia, Michael Regan, we thank you both.
Thank you.
Earlier in the day, the Obama administration went to Capitol Hill to make its case to allow government greater access to encrypted information. Essentially, the government wants to be able to read certain data that intelligence agencies can't get now because it's been protected with special codes. That's at the heart of an ongoing battle with tech companies.
Encryption is a great thing. It keeps us all safe. It protects innovation.
But FBI Director James Comey warned at Senate hearings today it's also a double-edged sword. That's because the technologies that seal off smartphones from surveillance also impede efforts to track criminals and terrorists.
We are moving inexorably to a place where all of our lives, all of our papers and effects, all of our communications will be covered by universal strong encryption. And that is a world that in some ways is wonderful and in some ways has serious public safety ramifications.
Google, Apple, and other tech firms have ramped up data encryption in the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations of sweeping government surveillance. They're also responding to stepped-up hacking coming from Russia and China. But at the same time, Islamic State followers and other militants are now using encrypted communications to recruit at a rapid pace. Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates underscored that point today.
ISIL currently communicates on Twitter, sending communications to thousands of would-be followers right here in our country. When someone responds and the conversations begin, they are then directed to encrypted platforms for further communication. And even with a court order, we can't see those communications. This is a serious threat, and our inability to access these communications with valid court orders is a real national security problem.
And the FBI's Comey suggested it's just a matter of time before that leads to a terror attack.
We are stopping these things so far through tremendous hard work, the use of sources, the use of online undercovers, but it is incredibly difficult. Right? I cannot see me stopping these indefinitely.
In a new report, 14 of the world's top cryptographers and computer scientists argue that giving the government access will compromise commercial and consumer secrets.
We are in a golden age of surveillance, not darkness.
Others focus today on privacy concerns. Peter Swire with the Georgia Institute of Technology said the government already has plenty of ways to track people.
For the first time in human history, most of us carry tracking devices called cell phones. And when you add in video surveillance and the upcoming Internet of Things, evidence about a suspect's whereabouts at a time and date is far, far more often available than ever before.
Ultimately, federal officials said they hope to work with tech firms to strike a balance between privacy interests and public safety. But where is that proper balance? For insight into that debate, we turn to Stuart Baker, who was Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush administration and General Counsel at the National Security Agency during the 1990s. And Susan Landau, she's one of the authors of the report objecting to increased government access. She's a professor of cybersecurity policy at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Stuart Baker, we heard James Comey say many things. Among them, he wrote that there's no doubt that bad people can communicate and that he essentially can't stop them with impunity. Tell me how that works.
So it is possible now to write codes that no one can break and to use those codes to communicate, to store everything on your phone in an encrypted fashion or to communicate with co-conspirators in a fashion really for the first time since we've had modern communications that no government can get into. And so government loses slowly the ability to understand what people are saying to each other on modern communications. Hasn't happened yet, but it clearly is getting ready to happen as encryption becomes ubiquitous.
Susan Landau, what is the danger in having the government have another tool in which they can use to protect us?
So it's not a question of having another tool. The real issue is whether or not we should have what they call exceptional access to encrypted communications. And exceptional access described in the abstract sounds good, but you have to actually think about it in particulars. For example, one technology that's been introduced is called forward secrecy. Forward secrecy is the idea that you have a key that you use an ephemeral key to encrypt your communications. So if at any point your key is stolen, all the past communications are secure. So if Sony had become aware, for example, when its keys were stolen, when its data was stolen, it could have changed keys and no new communications could have been intercepted, but even more importantly, all the old communications would have been safe against the people who hacked Sony.
So what the government
That's the issue. The issue is...
Go ahead.
The issue is that the government is saying exceptional access without explaining how they want this done, and all security matters in the details.
Well, let's talk about that. If the government is asking basically for these companies to share their keys, to allow backdoor access to our information for national security purposes, what are the limits of that?
So I think one of the things that's clear is the government isn't trying to say this is exactly how we want you to do it, because I'm sure that Susan Landau would be saying, well, that won't work, and we've got these objections to being told how to do it. The government is saying, here's a problem. We think it needs to be solved. There may be multiple ways to solve it. And indeed, there are. It is possible, for example, for the companies that make this encryption possible to keep keys or to store the data encrypted with their own keys as well as with the user's keys. This is really what the companies were doing until recently.
Susan Landau, you wrote somewhere that you consider this magical thinking. Explain why.
Right. So when Stu mentions the idea of keeping the data securely at the companies, we have numerous examples. For example, the Google database of surveillance targets was hacked, presumably by Chinese hackers, and what it did was a great counterintelligence operation that exposed which agents were under U.S. government surveillance. What we've seen over and over again is that with a determined opponent, the data is not secure. The only way it's secure is if there's end-to-end encryption. I completely agree with Director Comey that it makes the FBI's and law enforcement's job more difficult. But the question is balancing different types of security against each other. And Stu is correct that that I want specific suggestions, because the idea that we could come up with some magic solution that solves the problem isn't correct. You need specific solutions. You need to analyze them carefully to see where the security vulnerabilities are so that you don't introduce more problems.
Stuart Baker, what is the government asking for that's different than what they already have?
What they want to do is make sure that as this encryption becomes ubiquitous, that it does not leave them completely helpless even when they have a court order. They're asking companies to take that concern seriously and not simply say, that's not our problem, that's your problem. We're putting end-to-end strong encryption out there, and if terrorists use it or pedophiles use it, that's your problem too, it's not our problem. And what Jim Comey is saying is, no, that's a social problem. And yes, there are security risks in building in some capability for the government to get access to that, but there are security risks of a very different sort if we don't have access to those communications.
And Susan Landau, is there a middle ground here? Is there something that you can imagine the tech companies can concede that would allow the government to get a greater access, but not maybe the blanket access they may desire?
There is no easy way to enable easy access to everybody's communications and data at rest unless you have the keys stored in an insecure way, unless you have the systems done in an insecure way. That's why our tech report was very clear. Tell us a proposal. Don't say you can do it, but tell us a proposal and we can look at it and analyze it. There's also an issue that has not yet been brought up, which is that what happens when you have a multinational firm and communications between the US and the UK, or between the US and France, or between the US and China? Do both countries have access? How do you manage that? What happens when a US person travels overseas? If we're going to demand this sort of thing, then of course other nations will, and then US communications will be quite insecure.
Well, it sounds like you're right. There is no easy answer, and not a difficult one either. Susan Landau of the Worcester Polytechnic Institute and Stuart Baker of Steptoe & Johnson, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Concern continues to rise across the country about the nation's aging infrastructure. That concern is particularly apparent when looking at older pipelines that carry crude oil and natural gas. One of those pipelines carries oil under some of the most pristine water in the country, the Great Lakes Straits of Mackinac in Michigan. Scientists say a spill in the straits would be an environmental and economic disaster. Elizabeth Brackett from public television station WTTW in Chicago reports.
The air is crisp and the water is cool in the northern Great Lakes, a body of water that contains 90% of the fresh water in the United States. And it's the reason nearly 1 million tourists visit Mackinac Island every year.
You're back for another season? All right.
But this year, islanders have more on their minds than tourists. Just north of the famed Mackinac Bridge, 2 aging pipelines carry 20 million gallons of crude oil and natural gas a day under the Straits of Mackinac. Longtime island resident and former biological sciences professor Lorna Strauss worries about a possible pipeline break.
It would be a devastating thing. Oil is very hard to clean up. So I guess I'm worried that a leak would be close to an impossible thing to solve.
Pipeline number 5 is owned by Enbridge Energy. The Canadian company operates the largest crude oil and liquids pipeline system in the world. Line 5 is 645 miles long. It stretches from Wisconsin across Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas and terminates in Ontario, Canada. The 30-inch pipeline splits into 2 20-inch lines when it crosses 4.5 miles under the lake. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron join here at the Straits of Mackinac. Because this area is far from any major urban center, and because the shoreline is lined with forests and not agriculture, very little pollution gets into this water. That means these waters are some of the most pristine in all of the Great Lakes. 30 million people depend on the Great Lakes for their drinking water. And company spokesman Jason Mancham says that's one of the reasons why Enbridge works so hard to keep Line 5 safe.
Line 5 has been in operation here in Michigan for more than 60 years, and it's been operating safely and reliably at the Straits. We've not had any incidents over that 4.5-mile stretch.
It's those 62 years underwater that trouble retired Dow chemical engineer Gary Street.
My biggest concern is that the line is very, very old. It's probably suffered the usual wear and tear that any older facility can suffer. I think there's a real reason to be concerned that the line could fail at almost any time.
Over the last decade, we have safely transported more than 13 billion gallons of crude oil throughout the U.S. and Canada. That's a success rate of 99.9993%.
But a National Wildlife Federation report found that Enbridge was responsible for more than 800 oil spills between 1999 and 2010. Aging pipelines are a national concern. Over 5,000 spills were reported to the federal government over the last 15 years, including this major spill in Michigan. In July of 2010, an Enbridge pipeline ruptured in the Kalamazoo River, dumping 1 million gallons of oil near Marshall, Michigan. Enbridge spent $1 billion in 3 years on cleanup, and the EPA says oil still remains in the Kalamazoo. Environmental activist Jim Lively says it was that spill that prompted concern about the safety of the Enbridge pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac.
Just weeks before that spill, they had said very much the same thing. No concerns, this pipeline is very safe. And then it leaked for 17 hours, over 1 million gallons into the Kalamazoo River. The largest inland oil spill in America happened right here in Michigan.
What the incident did in the Kalamazoo River ultimately is it's made us a far safer company. We have gone through pretty radical wholesale changes across the board on things like advanced leak detection, pipeline integrity, training of our personnel.
The pipeline in the Straits is now monitored with computerized systems that operate both inside and outside the pipeline. The findings are analyzed in Enbridge's control room that operates 24/7 in Edmonton, Canada. In addition, Mancham says, dive teams physically inspect the pipeline every other year.
But it hasn't aged in the bottom of the water. The coating is in fantastic shape and the steel has not deteriorated. It looks just like it did in 1953.
Though there is one difference, says engineer Gary Street. The pipeline is now covered with invasive mussels, which didn't enter the Great Lakes until the 1980s.
Zebra mussels create 3 problems. They create extra weight on the pipeline, weight that was never allowed for in the design of the pipeline. They mask any problems from the outside that could be observed by a diver or by a remote camera. And the third thing is that the zebra mussels excrete a very acid material. If that acid material were to get behind the protective coating, it will cause corrosion and the line will fail prematurely.
What nearly everyone up here agrees on, even Enbridge, is that an oil spill in these pristine waters would have a major impact. Ecologist Knut Nadelhofer of the University of Michigan's Biological Field Station says the environmental impact of a spill could take years to overcome.
This is a fairly simple food chain. We have limited numbers of algae in the water, limited number of species, aquatic plants on the shorelines compared to more diverse ocean systems. Chemicals will propagate through this system faster. They're likely to change the system in ways that affect it for decades or centuries.
I got to bother you for a minute.
As the mayor of Mackinac Island gets ready to open her hotel for the season, it's not the next decade or century she's thinking about. It's the impact of an oil spill right now.
Mackinac Island is considered the gem of Michigan. As far as a tourist destination, it would be just catastrophic if something happened in the Straits area.
Enbridge insists a pipeline failure in the Straits would be detected almost immediately.
And we have isolation valves at each side of the Straits to isolate that particular section. And those valves would be completely closed within 3 minutes.
You shut the line at Mackinac City, you shut it off at St. Ignace, you still have 325,000 gallons in each of those lines that could spill, that can and will spill into the Straits.
That's why activists say the only sure way to avoid a possible environmental and economic disaster is to shut the pipeline down.
I believe that Enbridge is trying hard to make sure that they could minimize the spill. Of course they're trying to do that. But do I trust them? No. Should we trust them? Of course not. Not with this, not with the Great Lakes.
Shutting down the pipeline is one of the options being considered by a pipeline task force chaired by Michigan's Attorney General. The commission will also look at the economic impact of shutting down the 4.5-mile stretch under the Straits of Mackinac. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Elizabeth Brackett in Chicago.
The Chinese stock market has been in free fall over the past month, spurring worries that the contagion could spread beyond the massive nation's economic and political borders. Margaret Warner has the story.
Another brutal day ravaged China's two main stock markets in Shanghai and Shenzhen as a 3-week plunge accelerated. Small investors, who make up 85% of China's traders, have been hit hard. People like 67-year-old He Meizhen.
When I look at the index, I feel nervous all over my body. I worry so much. The market opens with a plunge to its daily limit. How can we stand it?
The benchmark Shanghai Composite Index lost another 6% of its value. It's down more than 30% since mid-June, and by day's end, nearly half of all stocks on the two exchanges had stopped trading. All of this despite a series of drastic moves by Beijing to rein in the selling. Financial analyst Michael Every in Hong Kong says so far nothing has worked.
Will they suspend the entire market? Possibly. I don't think anything can be ruled out if we keep seeing 8% falls day after day after day. One would hope not, because China was supposed to be moving towards greater reforms in the financial market area, and everything they're doing at the moment is backsliding from that.
Those reforms toward greater liberalization have been pushed by President Xi Jinping. And for a time, the market skyrocketed. From mid-June 2014 to mid-June 2015, the Chinese markets gained 150%. Even after recent losses, their value is still up 70% from a year ago. Chinese regulatory officials now complain of irrational selling driven by a panic sentiment. Others worry about what desperate investors might do.
The people work hard to make money. They're not bosses. They work hard. Older people use their retirement payment like us, selling things on the street to make money. People might kill people or set fire to things. People might die.
U.S. officials are also watching closely. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew counseled calm today.
I will say that China's markets are still pretty much separated from world markets. They're obviously moving towards being more integrated, but right now they're not. So you're not going to, I don't think, see the direct linkage there. I think the concern that is a real one is, what does it mean about long-term growth in China?
Still, there is some spillover. Hong Kong's main index dropped sharply today, as did Japan's, South Korea's, and Australia's.
And Margaret joins me now. So, Margaret, what is at the root of this, what seems like a sudden slide in the Chinese markets?
Gwen, it was really a classic bubble. Last year, the Chinese economic growth has actually been slowing, and the government started encouraging individual investors to get into this market and help capitalize these small entrepreneurial companies, not the big state-owned enterprises, but the ones that have trouble getting money from banks, sometimes with good reason. So they did it by, for one thing, relaxing the restrictions that used to not allow you to borrow money to finance your stock purchases. So that's the first thing. You now have all this margin lending. Well, then if the market goes down, these investors have to pay back with real money, either what they've got in the stock market or in other assets. And secondly, as that all developed, the ones that were caught are these smaller investors, which, as we said in the setup, are 85% of the market. These are uneducated people. You could see it in the quotes that we had from people. And so they are what's known as momentum investors. They jumped in like April and May when stocks were selling at 150%, price to earnings ratio, even worse than before the NASDAQ bubble here in 2000 in the US. And so they are getting tremendously hit because they weren't in for the run-up.
So does that mean that the government has had to step in to arrest this? Not so different from what we had to do in 2008.
True, but here's the difference. You saw some of the steps they took. They're making brokerage firms buy stocks. They're making executives no longer sell stocks. They're putting government money into it. The difference is that in the U.S., The U.S. bailed out big financial institutions that they thought posed a systemic risk to our whole system.
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail, classic. They did not say but they said our test is restoring GDP growth and employment. They didn't make the markets a test. So people didn't sit there and watch television and go, oh my God, we're failing. So what they're doing in China is they've set up the markets as the test of their own economic management and of this whole theory of economic liberalization. And the danger is, of course, that the more they do and it doesn't work overnight, then it encourages more panic selling, and that in fact it's going to make people lose confidence in the government's economic management.
So does this have political ramifications for President Xi?
Of course, and that's certainly clearly what the Chinese leadership's worried about. One, they had set this up as, really all-powerful leader, and getting into economic liberalization was considered a vote of confidence in his system. Okay, so they get more people in. As somebody said to me last night, he owned the run-up, he owns the slide. Secondly, they're worried about economic popular discontent. You could hear that from one of those people in our piece, that now that more Chinese own, and now it's small compared to the U.S. In the U.S., 55% of Americans are in the market in some way. In China, it's only been 10%. But this past year, it's by some estimates gone up to 17%, and these are poor people. So that is the threat that they're worried about. And then third, of course, is that if people don't feel confident, they're not going to buy things. Well, this is a government that said we're going to change our economy from export-driven to consumer-driven, and
but that's what is happening inside China. Is there a potential, briefly, for this to spread?
Well, as Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, said today, not in terms of investment exposure, because the Chinese have kept this market so insular. Only 5% of the investors are even foreign. But the danger is that it will slow economic growth, which will affect, because it's the world's second largest economy, will affect a lot of other export-driven economies, and that it could have a sort of knock-on effect on the commitment of President Xi to continue with economic reforms.
Fascinating, Margaret. Thanks for keeping us up to date.
My pleasure.
From financial problems abroad to a big money debate in this country. Last week, the United States Export-Import Bank hit a political wall. Its authority to conduct new business expired as Congress hotly debates whether it should exist. The bank is a multi-billion-dollar government agency that helps foreign companies buy American goods. Here's how that works. An American company wants to sell goods to a foreign corporation. The Export-Import Bank then gives the foreign company a loan or a loan guarantee, and that company buys the goods from the American business. Ideally, the loan gets repaid, but there is a risk to taxpayers that the foreign company could default. Who exactly benefits? Well, last year, the bank financed nearly $30 billion worth of U.S. exports. The single largest winner? Boeing and the aircraft industry. Thousands of small businesses also gained, with more than $10 billion in financing. But the 81-year-old bank faces an uncertain future. Some conservatives argue that it's a bloated government giveaway, while others insist it's a critical competitive tool for American business. Joining me now to discuss all this from Capitol Hill are two members of Congress, Democrat Brad Sherman of California, and we hope to be joined shortly by Republican Jim Jordan of Ohio. Congressman Sherman, thank you very much for joining us. Let me just begin with one of the main criticisms one hears from Republicans, and that is that the Export-Import Bank is all about corporate welfare, that something like $8 billion went, as we said last year, to Boeing and other big companies that really don't need this kind of government help?
The money goes to those who are buying our products. By making these loans, we support tens of billions of dollars of exports and 164,000 jobs. Many of those jobs are with big employers. Others are with smaller employers, including all of Boeing's suppliers, but also up to roughly 90% of the bank's total transactions are with small businesses that are exporting. We need to support 164,000 jobs, and we can't sacrifice them in the worship of Ayn Rand, the deity of libertarianism.
But the argument is still that it's these big companies like Boeing that get the lion's share of the money.
Well, Boeing doesn't get the money. The money goes to the customers, and you're trying to out-compete Airbus, for example. You're trying to out-compete some of the best competition in the world, world-class competition. They have their finance authorities. Germany has triple the size that we do. France, Japan, China are all using this system to get their exporters the contract. If we don't get the contract, we lose the 164,000 jobs.
Let me make another point that one hears from the critics, and that is that this Export-Import Bank is really helping just a small percent, a tiny percentage of the total exports the United States engages in, that it's a drop in the bucket, and if the bank goes away, it's not going to make much difference.
164,000 jobs is just a drop in the bucket to the United States economy. But we can't afford to give up one job. We certainly can't afford to give up 164,000 jobs. And if we abolished everything we did in Washington that created fewer than 164,000 jobs, then we'd lose 1% of our economy here, 1% of our economy there. And remember, just 1 or 2% unemployment rate is the difference between a healthy economy and an unhealthy economy.
The other criticism we hear, and it's related to what you just said, is that these jobs numbers are truly inflated, that they've been calculated, cooked up, so to speak, to make it look like the bank is making a big difference, when in reality, it's not the case. What do you say to the opponents, to the critics who say these are not real numbers?
It's clear that the exports being financed support 164,000 jobs. Now, you can guess how many of those contracts we would have gotten otherwise, but that's like telling Ford to abandon its finance promotion and people will still buy the cars. The fact is, Chevy and Toyota are offering pretty good cars as well. That's why Ford has, from time to time, finance promotion. That's why the other auto companies do as well. And if you tell our companies we cannot have finance promotion, but the German companies will, the French companies will, the Chinese companies will, we're going to lose jobs. And that's why it's important for these 164,000 jobs that we reauthorize an agency that makes money for the federal government. Almost $700 million last year, nearly $7 billion over the last couple of decades.
And that is exactly a point that one reads the critics making, and that is they're saying that in all the government doesn't gain from this. It ends up paying because of the money that ends up going to these companies that could make the money otherwise. And the taxpayers end up the ones who are held liable, and American taxpayers lose out.
The CBO is the scorekeeper around here. And we even have instant replay. We can look back over the last 20 years and see this bank has transferred almost $7 billion to the Treasury. CBO says they made $700 million last year. And this is after taking into account their costs of operation and an allowance for bad debts. So this is the CBO tells us that if we abolish this agency, the deficit has gone up by almost $1 billion. It's making money.
Just finally, what's your forecast? Do you think this bank is going to survive or not?
It needs to be resurrected at this point, and resurrections are difficult and rare. But I think that we will be successful. Overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate realize that this entity creates jobs and makes money, and that the opponents are simply clinging to this ideological, theological belief that these agencies shouldn't exist. And they might be right in a world in which Germany, Japan, and China did not have similar agencies. We have to compete, and that's why we need this agency to help our exporters compete with those other exporters.
Representative Brad Sherman, thank you. And as we said, we had hoped to have Representative Jim Jordan join us. We hope to talk to him in the future. We thank you again.
Thank you.